A nice day in Lucca, Italy. This is a small Italian city, about 50 kilometers west of Florence, just north of Pisa. This is how you imagine an old Italian city would look like. Narrow alleys, stone houses, cobblestone. Quite a cozy city to visit and not as touristy as other spots in Italy like Florence, Rome, or Milan. But I was thinking that I should tell you how I set up my camera when I go traveling. I'm not telling you that you should do like I do, but maybe you get some ideas of how you could do it. I have a Sony A7IV, but this works on every camera, every brand. And if you don't know how to set up your camera, Google it, watch YouTube, or read the manual. If you don't know how to do it on a Sony camera, leave a comment and I will show you in a video. So let's get into it. I presume that you know about the dial, what MSA and so on stands for. It could be named differently from camera to camera. I use manual M when I'm on a stand or if I use flash. I don't bring a flash when I'm traveling, so when I'm on a stand, I use manual. Otherwise, I'm in aperture priority. Aperture priority means that I choose the aperture and I let the camera choose the shutter speed and the ISO, if you put the ISO in auto. But then I have 3 custom settings in photo on this camera. Custom setting number 1 is aperture priority. So why do I have an aperture priority when I already have an aperture priority? Well, in this, I have set limits on the ISO and the shutter speed. So the shutter speed never goes down below 125th of a second, with one exception. The ISO never goes higher than 8,000. The only time the shutter speed goes slower than 125th of a second is if the camera thinks it needs more light than 8,000 ISO and 125th of a second, then the shutter speed is gonna get slower because the maximum ISO will remain 8,000. And that is what I use from day to day. I could set a limit even in aperture priority, but I leave that because that I could change from time to time. If it gets dark, maybe I could do with 80th of a second in shutter speed if I don't have a moving subject. The second custom setting I use for bracket. I take 3 shots with 2 stops over and 2 stops under and 1 normal exposure. So the first shot will be a normal exposure, then 2 stops under and 2 stops over, or is it vice versa? I can't remember. But 3 shots anyway of the same subject. Very good if you're indoors, like taking pictures in churches, mosques, palaces, something like that. Very good to get all the details inside of a place. And when I choose this, the aperture will be fixed at f11, the ISO at 100 ISO. So the only thing that changes is the shutter speed between the shots. Of course, I can change the ISO and the aperture as well, but f11 is normally quite good if you want most of the things in focus, like if you're in a church and want to take a picture. The third custom setting is because I'm filming. So this is interval shooting. It will take 1 picture every 1/3 of a second, so I can make thumbnails for YouTube. The problem is that continuous autofocus doesn't work in interval shooting, so I have to set the focus manually before I press the trigger. But that's how it is. I think it's a shame. I think you should be able to use continuous autofocus even in interval shooting, but you can't. And then we have a lot of other buttons and wheels and whatnot on the camera. Some cameras have more, some cameras have less. I will go through how I set up the buttons and the wheels. First of all, some lenses have a button on the lens. Not all of my lenses have that, so I haven't programmed anything for that button because there is none. Let's take the first button, and that is this one, up to the left on the camera. And for this, I have focus mode. It's set to continuous autofocus mostly, but I can change it depending on the situation. For example, I can easily go into manual focus, just pressing this button and scroll the wheel to manual focus. The second is this one, just above the screen. There I have drive mode, if I want maybe a self-timer, if I want to do burst shoot or something. I go into drive mode. The third button up here I use for metering mode. And metering mode is quite useful. Because I use aperture priority most of the time, I let the camera choose what shutter speed and what ISO to use. But sometimes you have like darker subject and bright sky, so the camera doesn't really know what to meter for the right exposure. And then I can change the metering mode. I can have it fixed in the center, I can have it average over the whole picture, and so on. So I can easily change so the camera knows better what to do, how to meter my shot and choose the shutter speed and the ISO. We have an AF on button here. I use that for back button focus, but not in the way I used to use back button focus on my Canon cameras. I use this, if I have pressed the shutter, it focuses. And if I then press the AF on button, the focus stays still there. And then I can move the camera and still, the focus is still gonna be where I put it first time. So it's sort of a semi back button focus, sort of. We have a button right up by the shutter, and that is for focus area, where I want the camera to focus. Normally I set it to wide because the autofocus on this camera is quite good. But sometimes I use center fixed. If I want to take a picture through a window or something, maybe there's a wall with a hole in it and I want to take a picture through that hole, I do center focus so that the camera doesn't focus on the wall, because it's in the center I want the focus to be, obviously. The trash can I use for changing between human, bird and animal IAF. And that's also quite useful if you want to take a picture of a bird or a dog or a human and change between those. Just press this button and I can change it. I can, of course, also go into function where I can scroll through a lot of settings. For example, changing the white balance. I normally don't change the white balance when taking photos because I shoot in RAW, so I can change the white balance afterwards. But sometimes, especially if I'm on a stand and I have time, I change the white balance so I get more confident that my photos will turn out good. Because the thing that is shown on your screen isn't the raw image, it's a JPEG. So camera shows a JPEG with the white balance that has been chosen either by the camera or by you. I can also press the wheel. So if I press the wheel up, I change what's on the display. Normally, I just have it so I can see the histogram and also if my camera is level. And especially when I'm on a stand, that's useful to see if the camera is level. If I press it right, that's where I change my ISO. So I press the right and then I can scroll the wheel to change what my ISO setting should be. If I press it down, I go into APS-C mode. And I don't shoot with APS-C mode much because I lose resolution. On the full frame setting, I have 33 megapixels, but I think it's like 18 megapixels in APS-C mode, so I will lose quite a bit of resolution. 18 megapixels is quite decent anyway. Only time I shoot with APS-C mode is at the end of the focal length. This lens will go to 200. And if I want longer, if I want more compression, I go to APS-C mode. That's the only way I'm gonna do APS-C mode. Unless for video, sometimes I zoom in by pressing the APS-C mode on the camera. A few more things. The wheels up on the camera. The front wheel, just in front of the shutter, I've set so I can choose my aperture. Because I'm in aperture priority most of the time, I can just choose the aperture with this wheel and then press the trigger. On the back side is where I change the shutter speed. If I'm in manual mode, for example, if I'm on a stand, I can choose my shutter speed on this wheel. The last wheel, on this camera, I can program that wheel to be whatever I want nearly, but I still have it on exposure compensation. Mostly because I'm in aperture priority. Let's say that you're taking a picture at night and you have bright street lights that may get overexposed if you let the camera choose what exposure settings it should use. You can turn the exposure compensation down maybe one stop. One stop, the shadows are still recoverable. 2 stops, maybe, but lower than that, it soon get noisy and so on. But I can use it a little bit just so the street lights doesn't get, that they don't get overexposed. Well, I think that was my setup. Did I forget something? Now I'm gonna go and have some Italian espresso, Italian coffee. Ciao.